The storm was not supposed to exist. That was the first thought that crossed Elias Mar's mind as the sky above the outpost began to tear itself apart. He stood near the main sensor tower, one gloved hand resting on a metal railing, watching the horizon twist into colors no atmospheric model had ever predicted. White lightning bent sideways, crawling across the clouds like living veins. The ground trembled, not in short quakes, but in long, uneasy waves that made the metal beneath his boots hum. The outpost alarms came too late. Red lights flashed across the compound as the warning sirens howled, sharp and panicked. Automated systems shouted evacuation codes in half a dozen alien languages. Elias did not need the translation. He already knew what it meant. Run. Now. He turned and sprinted toward the central corridor just as a shockwave slammed into the outer wall. The impact threw him forward, his shoulder crashing into the doorway. Pain flared, but he pushed through it, boots pounding against the floor as gravity shifted unpredictably beneath him. Behind him, the sky screamed. Elias had been stationed on this listening outpost for 6 months, maintaining systems most species no longer trusted humans to touch. He was an engineer, not a soldier, but the frontier did not care about job titles. Out here, everyone survived or failed by the same rules. Another tremor hit, stronger this time. The corridor lights flickered, then went dark. Emergency glow strips activated along the floor, casting the world in a dull blue haze. Evacuation pods launching, the system announced. Too soon, Elias thought. He reached the junction where the pods were housed just in time to see the last one detach from the platform. Its engines flared bright, then vanished into the chaos outside. There was no time to curse, no time to shout. He already knew there would be no second chance. A shape stood frozen near the wall. Kethvar. The alien observer was taller than Elias, their frame long and angular, skin a muted gray that reflected the emergency lights like dull stone. 4 eyes blinked out of sync, wide with something that was not quite fear but close enough. "They left," Kethvar said, voice tight and flat through the translator collar. "This facility is now non-viable." Elias grabbed their arm. It was cold and rigid under his glove. "Come on," Elias said. "There's still one place." The ground lurched violently, throwing both of them sideways. A distant explosion echoed through the structure as one of the outer modules tore free. Air pressure screamed through the corridors. Kethvar resisted, pulling back. "There is no safe structure rated for this event. The data can be wrong," Elias snapped. "Feet move. Now." Something in his tone cut through the alien's hesitation. Kethvar followed as Elias dragged them down a narrow service passage rarely used anymore. Panels had been stripped from the walls long ago, wires and conduits exposed like veins under skin. At the far end stood a heavy door marked with faded symbols, an emergency shelter, old, obsolete. Designed back when humans were still considered experimental participants in interstellar operations. Elias slammed his palm against the manual release. The door resisted, then opened with a deep groan. Inside was a single room. One bed was bolted to the floor, reinforced with thick restraints. One console flickered weakly on the far wall. The air smelled stale, unused for decades. The door slammed shut behind them as Elias punched the seal control. The moment it locked, the shelter shuddered as if struck by a giant fist. Kethvar staggered, barely keeping their balance. "This structure is insufficient," they said. "It was not designed to withstand." "I know," Elias said, already moving. He crossed the room in long strides, ripping open a maintenance panel beneath the console. The screen flashed warnings in rapid succession, each one worse than the last. Power fluctuations, atmospheric instability, structural stress far beyond limits. Outside, the storm roared like a living thing. The shelter rocked violently, throwing Elias against the wall. He grunted, caught himself, and kept working. His fingers moved quickly, disconnecting automated controls and rerouting power manually. Kethvar watched in stunned silence. "You are disabling the safety systems," the alien said. "They'll shut us down to protect the hardware," Elias replied. "I'm protecting the people." "There are 2 occupants," Kethvar said. "This shelter is rated for 1. Elias did not look back. "Then we'll make it work." Another wave of force hit, harder than before. The lights dimmed, then stabilized. Dust drifted from the ceiling. Kethvar's breathing had grown uneven, their chest rising and falling too fast. Their species was not built for sustained stress. Elias knew that. Everyone did. That was why they were observers, diplomats, analysts, not survivors of storms like this. Elias finished his adjustments and stood, wiping sweat from his brow. He finally looked at Kethvar. "Sit," he said, pointing to the bed. "That position is for shock anchoring," Kethvar said. "It will not accommodate 2 physiologies safely." "Sit," Elias repeated, firmer this time. Another thunderous impact made the decision for them. Kethvar stumbled, and Elias caught them, guiding them onto the reinforced bed. He strapped the restraints across the alien's torso with careful hands, tightening them just enough to keep them secure without causing pain. Kethvar's eyes followed his movements. "You are prioritizing me," they said. "That is illogical." Elias gave a small, humorless smile. "Get used to it." The shelter groaned, metal screaming under impossible strain. The console beeped urgently as external sensors failed one by one. Elias turned back to the panel and made one final adjustment. He redirected a larger portion of the remaining life support capacity toward the bed. Kethvar noticed immediately. "You have reduced your own atmospheric intake." "Yeah," Elias said. "I'll manage." "That reduction exceeds human comfort thresholds." "Comfort's not the goal." Outside, the storm reached a new pitch. The sound was no longer thunder but something deeper, as if the planet itself was tearing apart. Gravity shifted sharply, pulling Elias sideways. He slammed into the wall, breath leaving his lungs in a sharp burst. For a brief moment, darkness crept at the edges of his vision. He forced himself upright, planting his boots wide. He focused on slow, controlled breaths, feeling the thinner air scrape his lungs. Kethvar watched, silent now. "You will suffer harm," the alien said softly. "Probably," Elias replied, "but not today." Time stretched strangely inside the shelter. Seconds felt too long, then vanished entirely. The storm outside twisted the rules of physics, bending them like thin wire. The shelter rattled endlessly, each vibration a reminder of how close they were to being torn apart. Elias stayed on his feet, monitoring the console, making small adjustments whenever a system dipped too low. His hands shook, partly from strain, partly from the cold creeping in as power waned. Kethvar finally broke the silence. "Human Mar." "Elias," he said. "Elias," Kethvar repeated, the unfamiliar name awkward in their voice. "Why did you return for me? Evacuation success would have increased had you fled alone." Elias considered the question as another shockwave rolled through the shelter. "Because leaving you behind wasn't an option," he said simply. "That is not a strategic answer. Doesn't have to be." The storm howled louder, as if offended by the defiance of a single outdated shelter and 2 fragile lives inside it. The walls bowed inward, then held. Barely. Kethvar stared at Elias with something new in their eyes. Not fear, not confusion, recognition. Outside, the universe raged. Inside, a human stood his ground, breathing thin air, hands steady on dying systems, refusing to let the storm decide who lived and who did not. And this was only the beginning. The shelter did not break. That fact surprised Elias more than anything else. He had expected metal to tear, bolts to snap, the ceiling to collapse under the screaming pressure of the storm outside. Instead, the walls held, groaning like something alive and in pain but still standing. The console lights dimmed again. A sharp warning tone echoed through the room before Elias muted it with a quick tap. He did not need more noise. The storm provided enough of that already. Kethvar remained strapped to the reinforced bed, their long limbs held firmly by the restraints. Their breathing was shallow now, controlled but tense. The thin layer of air swirling around them shimmered faintly as the shelter struggled to keep conditions stable. Elias leaned against the wall for a moment, closing his eyes. His head throbbed. Each breath burned slightly, the reduced oxygen making his chest feel tight and heavy. He pushed the feeling aside. Panic wasted energy, and energy was something he could not afford. Another violent pull of gravity yanked sideways. Elias slid several steps before slamming his shoulder into the corner of the console. Pain shot down his arm. He bit back a shout and forced himself upright. Structural stress increasing, the system announced. "Yeah, I can hear it," Elias muttered. He opened the lower panel again and adjusted the manual stabilizers, rerouting power from non-essential systems. Heat regulation dropped immediately. The air grew colder. Kethvar noticed the change. "Temperature decline detected," they said. "This will affect your muscular response." "Add it to the list," Elias replied. The storm outside changed its rhythm. Instead of constant impacts, there were long pauses followed by sudden, crushing waves that made the entire shelter lurch as one piece. During each pause, an unnatural silence pressed in, broken only by the faint hum of failing systems and the sound of their breathing. Kethvar spoke during one of those pauses. "The storm exhibits adaptive behavior." Elias glanced at them. "That sounds bad." "It is," Kethvar said. "This phenomenon is not purely atmospheric. It reacts to resistance." "So it doesn't like being ignored," Elias said. "Correct." The shelter shuddered violently as if the storm had heard them. Elias pushed himself away from the console and crossed the room carefully, adjusting his balance with each step. He knelt beside the bed and checked the restraints again. Kethvar's skin felt even colder than before. "You okay?" Elias asked. "I am stable," Kethvar replied. "However, your condition is deteriorating." Elias smiled faintly. "You always this honest." "Honesty is efficient," Kethvar said. "Your heart rate is elevated. Your coordination has declined by 12%. Good thing I don't need to dance." Another pause settled over the shelter. Elias sat on the floor back against the bed frame, conserving energy. He flexed his fingers slowly, keeping circulation going. His breath fogged slightly in the dim air. The storm struck again without warning. The floor dropped. Not downward but sideways, gravity twisting violently. Elias was lifted off the ground and slammed hard against the opposite wall. Something cracked in the ceiling, sending a spray of dust and insulation into the air. Kethvar cried out, their voice distorted as the restraints strained to hold them in place. The bed groaned but did not break free. Elias hit the floor hard when gravity snapped back into place. He lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, blinking away stars. His ribs ached. He tested his arms and legs one by one. Pain, but nothing useless. He forced himself to stand. A thin line of light appeared along one wall. Elias froze. The storm had breached the outer layer. Radiation warnings flashed briefly on the console before Elias shut them down. The readings spiked, then settled just below lethal levels. Just below. He moved quickly now, pulling a sealant canister from a storage compartment. He sprayed the crack, the foam expanding rapidly to fill the gap. The shelter groaned in protest, but the light faded. Kethvar watched every movement. "You acted without hesitation." "Didn't have time," Elias said. "That exposure increased your cumulative risk." "Still breathing," Elias replied. "That's the important part." Time lost meaning as the storm continued its assault. Elias could not tell how long they had been trapped. His internal clock felt wrong, stretched thin by exhaustion, and the strange way the storm warped everything around it. At some point, the console went dark entirely. The hum of the shelter faded until there was only silence and the distant roar outside. The emergency glow strips flickered once, then died. Darkness filled the room. Kethvar's voice came softly through the black. "Power failure." "I know," Elias said. He moved carefully, hands outstretched, counting steps until he reached the bed again. He sat with his back against it, knees drawn slightly upward. The cold deepened quickly now. Without power, the shelter was nothing more than a metal shell. Kethvar spoke again. "Your species exhibits unusual tolerance for prolonged deprivation." "Don't let the reputation fool you," Elias said. "We just complain less when it matters." Silence returned. Elias focused on breathing slowly, evenly. His lungs burned, but he welcomed the pain. It meant he was still alive. The storm outside shifted again. The sound changed, becoming lower, more distant. The pressure against the walls eased slightly. Elias frowned. He had learned long ago that quiet could be more dangerous than noise. A sudden impact struck the shelter from below, lifting it several centimeters off the ground before slamming it back down. Elias' teeth clicked together painfully. Kethvar's restraints tightened automatically, locking into a more rigid configuration. "The storm is attempting destabilization through resonance," Kethvar said. "Of course it is," Elias replied weakly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small hand tool, more habit than usefulness. He gripped it tightly, grounding himself in the familiar shape. Minutes passed, or hours. Elias was no longer sure. His vision blurred occasionally, dark spots drifting in and out. He shifted his position, trying to stay alert. Sleep would be dangerous now. Kethvar noticed the change in his breathing. "You are losing efficiency." "Yeah," Elias said quietly. "Hard to argue with that." "Why do humans continue when survival probability drops below acceptable thresholds?" Kethvar asked. Elias thought about it for a long moment. "Because the numbers don't decide everything," he said. "Sometimes you keep going because stopping means someone else pays the price." Another long pause followed. The storm outside began to weaken, its fury turning uneven, less focused. Kethvar finally spoke. "If this shelter fails, you will not survive long in the open." Elias smiled faintly in the darkness. "Funny thing, humans aren't great at planning exits. We're better at holding on." The shelter shuddered one last time, then slowly, almost cautiously, grew still. The storm did not end. But for the first time since they had entered the shelter, it hesitated. Elias closed his eyes briefly, allowing himself a single breath of relief. The fight was not over, he knew that, but the shelter still stood. Kethvar was alive. And as long as that was true, Elias would keep standing too. The silence did not last. Elias sensed it before it happened, a deep pressure in his chest, like the air itself was holding its breath. The storm outside had gone quiet, but it was not resting. It was listening. The shelter creaked softly, metal cooling and contracting after hours of strain. Elias kept his eyes open, forcing himself to stay awake. His thoughts drifted slower now, each one heavier than the last. The cold had settled deep into his bones, and his fingers felt stiff no matter how often he moved them. Kethvar remained strapped to the bed, unmoving except for the steady rise and fall of their chest. Their breathing had slowed, but it was controlled. Their species conserved energy well, humans did not. A low vibration passed through the floor. Elias straightened immediately. "Here we go," he whispered. The vibration grew stronger, turning into a slow, rolling pulse. The shelter did not shake this time. Instead, it tilted gently, as if the ground beneath it was being lifted and lowered by massive, unseen hands. Gravity shifted again, but more smoothly than before. Elias felt heavier, then lighter, then heavier again. His stomach turned. Kethvar spoke, their voice calm but tense. "The storm is altering local gravitational vectors in a stable pattern." "Stable is good," Elias said, though he was not convinced. "It is not good," Kethvar replied. "It suggests intent." The shelter's walls began to glow faintly, thin lines of pale light spreading across the metal like frost patterns. Elias stared, his breath catching. "That's new," he said. The storm is interacting with the structure at a submolecular level, Kethvar explained. It is testing limits. Of course it is, Elias muttered. The glow intensified, then faded. A deep, resonant hum filled the room, low enough that Elias felt it more than heard it. His teeth vibrated slightly. Then the bed moved, not violently, slowly. The reinforced frame shifted several centimeters toward the center of the room, dragged by a pull Elias could not see. The restraints tightened automatically to keep Kethvar secure. Elias pushed himself to his feet, legs unsteady. Okay, I don't like that. He staggered toward the console, even though it was dead. Habit guided him more than logic. He placed a hand against the wall, feeling the vibration travel through the metal and into his bones. The hum grew louder. The shelter is becoming a focal point, Kethvar said. The storm is converging. Meaning? Elias asked. Meaning it has noticed us. The floor lurched upward sharply, throwing Elias into the air. He hit the ceiling hard, pain exploding through his back, then crashed back down. He gasped, struggling to pull air into burning lungs. The bed slammed down harder, but the anchor held. Elias lay on the floor, coughing, vision swimming. He forced himself to roll onto his side, then onto his hands and knees. Every movement felt slow, delayed, like his body was working through thick liquid. Kethvar watched him closely. Your condition is critical. Still, moving, Elias said between breaths. Another pull of gravity dragged everything toward the bed. Elias was pulled several feet across the floor before he managed to grab a floor anchor and hold himself in place. The shelter groaned loudly, bolts screaming as unseen forces strained against them. Kethvar's eyes widened. The bed is acting as a gravitational sink. Elias looked at the reinforced frame, then at the restraints holding Kethvar in place. Can you get free? He asked. Negative, Kethvar said. The system has locked into maximum stabilization mode. Elias swore under his breath. The pull increased. Tools, loose panels, and debris slid across the floor, slamming into the bed frame with sharp metallic clangs. Elias felt himself slipping, his grip weakening as his hands trembled. He made a decision. Letting go, Elias allowed the pull to drag him toward the bed. He slammed into the frame hard, knocking the breath from his lungs. He wrapped his arms around one of the thick support bars, locking himself in place. The hum reached a painful pitch. Kethvar looked down at him. You are endangering yourself. Elias laughed weakly. Been doing that all day. The storm outside roared back to life, but now it sounded focused, angry. The shelter shook violently as if something massive was circling it. Then the gravity reversed. Everything was thrown outward. Elias was ripped from the bed, flung across the room, and slammed into the far wall. He cried out as pain tore through his side. He slid to the floor, gasping, unable to move for several long seconds. The bed held, but only just. Cracks spread along the walls, thin and glowing again. The hum fractured into chaotic noise. Kethvar's voice cut through it all. The structure is failing. Probability of collapse has increased significantly. Elias forced himself to sit up. Blood trickled from a cut on his forehead, warm against his cold skin. He wiped it away with shaking fingers. No kidding, he said. He looked at the bed, at the way the storm seemed to tug at it as if trying to pull it apart piece by piece. His mind raced, slow but stubborn. The bed wasn't just reinforced. It was designed to absorb force, to spread it out, to ground it safely. It's not failing, Elias murmured. It's fighting back. Kethvar tilted their head slightly. Explain. The bed, Elias said, pushing himself to his feet. It's built to take shock, right? To anchor during extreme events? Yes. And the storm keeps pulling at it, Elias continued, which means it's reacting to resistance, like you said before. Kethvar was silent. Elias staggered closer, bracing himself against the frame. What if we stop fighting it? That would result in catastrophic displacement, Kethvar said. Not completely, Elias replied. Just enough. He reached for the restraint controls built into the bed. His fingers fumbled clumsily, vision blurring again. He blinked hard, forcing focus. Kethvar's eyes widened. "What are you doing?" "Trust me," Elias said. "Or don't, but this is our best shot." He loosened the shock-dampening setting slightly, allowing the bed to move more freely. Immediately, the hum changed. The violent pulling softened, turning into a smoother, rhythmic pulse. The cracks in the walls stopped spreading. The shelter still shook, but it was different now. Less angry, less sharp. Kethvar stared at Elias. "You have altered the interaction." "Yeah," Elias said weakly. "I figured the storm doesn't like stiff things, so we bend." Another wave passed through the shelter, but instead of slamming into it, the force flowed around the bed like water around a rock. The noise outside faded slightly. Elias slumped against the bed, exhausted. His legs barely held him upright. Kethvar studied the readings on their wrist display. Structural integrity is stabilizing. Elias let out a shaky breath. "Good." Silence crept back in, broken only by the faint hum of the storm, now distant again. Elias slid down to sit on the floor back against the bed. His head lolled forward as exhaustion finally began to win. "Elias," Kethvar said. "Yeah," he murmured. "If you lose consciousness, you may not recover." "Working on it," Elias said. He forced his eyes open, staring at the dim outlines of the room. He focused on small things, the feel of the floor, the sound of his breathing, the fact that the shelter was still standing. Kethvar watched him quietly. "You altered a system without complete data," the alien said. "That was reckless." Elias smiled faintly. "That's kind of our thing." The storm did not strike again. It circled, distant and restless, as if reconsidering. Inside the battered shelter, a human sat awake through pain and cold, having chosen to bend instead of break, refusing to let the universe decide the outcome alone. And for now, that was enough. The storm changed again. It no longer circled like a distant threat. It pressed inward, slow and heavy, like something testing the last strength of a locked door. The shelter answered with tired groans, metal flexing in long, aching sounds that seemed to travel through Elias' bones. He stayed seated against the bed, eyes open, forcing himself to breathe evenly. Every breath felt shallow now. His chest burned and his heartbeat thudded loud in his ears. The cold had crept so deep that his hands barely felt his own fingers. Kethvar watched him closely. Their four eyes reflected the faint glow from the cracks in the walls, unblinking. "You are approaching human failure thresholds," Kethvar said quietly. Elias gave a weak chuckle. "You keep track of that stuff." "Yes," Kethvar replied. "It is difficult to ignore." The hum outside deepened, no longer chaotic but steady and focused. The floor vibrated beneath them, not violently but with purpose. Elias frowned. "That's not good." "The storm is compressing," Kethvar said. "It is concentrating force." "Like winding up before a punch," Elias muttered. The shelter shook suddenly, harder than it had since the bed adjustment. Elias was thrown forward, catching himself just before his head hit the frame. Pain flared in his side, sharp and breath-stealing. A new sound followed. A tearing sound. Elias looked up just in time to see the outer wall bend inward. The metal stretched, glowing faintly, then split open with a loud crack. A blast of freezing air rushed in, carrying fine debris and a dangerous shimmer of radiation. Elias reacted without thinking. He grabbed the sealant canister again, pushing himself toward the breach. Kethvar's voice rose. "Do not approach. Exposure levels are lethal." "Only if I stay," Elias said through clenched teeth. The pull of the storm fought him every step of the way, dragging him sideways, trying to pull him toward the glowing tier. His boots slipped on the floor, hands numb as he sprayed the sealant into the widening crack. The foam struggled to expand, shredded by the pressure difference. Elias leaned into it, using his body weight to hold it in place. Pain exploded in his shoulder as debris slammed into him. He cried out but did not let go. The sealant finally took hold, hardening into a rough barrier. The glow faded. The rush of air slowed to a weak hiss, then stopped. Elias collapsed backward, gasping, lungs burning as if filled with fire. His vision blurred, dark spots swimming in front of his eyes. Kethvar watched in stunned silence. "You exited safe positioning," the alien said. "Your survival probability decreased drastically." Elias lay on the floor, chest heaving. "Still here." Another deep tremor shook the shelter, but the sealed wall held. Elias did not move for several seconds. His body felt heavy, unresponsive. When he finally forced himself to roll onto his side, his limbs trembled violently. Kethvar spoke again, softer now. "Why do you continue?" Elias stared at the ceiling, blinking slowly. "Because if I stop, you don't make it." "That assumption is statistically flawed," Kethvar said. "Your death would increase my survival odds due to resource redistribution." Elias laughed weakly. "Yeah, but you don't believe that." Kethvar was silent. The storm pressed harder. The shelter's internal supports began to fail one by one, snapping with loud metallic cracks. The bed's anchor systems whined loudly, straining to keep their balance. Elias pushed himself upright, using the bed frame to pull himself to his feet. His legs shook badly, threatening to fold under him. "The shelter won't last much longer," Kethvar said. "You should secure yourself." Elias shook his head slowly. "Not yet." He staggered to the console, dead and dark, and pulled open another panel. Inside were old emergency components, long abandoned by modern standards. Analog controls. Elias smiled faintly. "Of course," he whispered. He worked slowly, hands clumsy, fingers barely responding. He rerouted the remaining mechanical systems, bypassing electronic controls entirely. The shelter responded with a low, steady vibration, different from the storm's hum. "What are you doing?" Kethvar asked. "Giving it something solid to push against," Elias said. "Not rigid. Just human." The storm struck again, harder than before. The shelter rocked violently, lifting off the ground for a brief moment before slamming back down. Elias was thrown sideways, crashing into the console. He cried out as pain flared through his ribs. But the shelter did not tear. The vibration from the mechanical system spread through the walls, absorbing some of the force, bleeding it away slowly instead of all at once. Kethvar stared at the readings on their wrist display. "Structural degradation has slowed." "Good," Elias said weakly. Another crack sounded, this time from the ceiling. A support beam bent dangerously low, threatening to collapse. Elias looked up, calculating. He took 3 unsteady steps, grabbed a loose brace from the floor, and wedged it into place beneath the beam. His arms screamed in protest as he forced it to hold. The beam shuddered, then stopped moving. Elias sagged against the wall, breathing hard. The storm roared in frustration, its sound rising to a deafening pitch. Gravity surged wildly, slamming Elias to the floor again. He curled instinctively, protecting his head. Kethvar's restraints tightened fully as the bed anchored itself with a deep, metallic clang. The shelter screamed. Then, suddenly, the storm changed. The pressure dropped. The roar faded into a distant rumble. The violent pulls softened into slow, rolling waves. Elias lay on the floor, barely aware of the shift. His eyes fluttered, struggling to stay open. Kethvar noticed immediately. "The storm is destabilizing." Elias managed a weak smile. "Told you, it hates being resisted." "You did not resist," Kethvar corrected. "You adapted." The shelter shook one last time, then settled. The hum faded almost completely. Silence filled the room, heavy and unreal. Elias did not move. Kethvar's eyes widened. "Elias," no response. The alien strained against the restraints, panic breaking through their normally controlled demeanor. "Elias Mar." Elias stirred faintly, a shallow breath escaping his lips. "I'm here," he whispered. "You are losing consciousness," Kethvar said urgently. "Yeah," Elias murmured. "Hard not to." The shelter creaked softly as the last echoes of the storm drifted away. The cracks in the walls dimmed, then went dark. Kethvar watched Elias closely, their voice low and steady now. You must remain awake. Trying, Elias said. His eyes fluttered again. Kethvar did something unexpected. They began to speak, not warnings, not data. They spoke about the storm, about how their people classified danger, about how humans were considered weak because they lacked natural armor, lacked environmental tolerance, lacked biological efficiency. You do not lack strength, Kethvar said quietly. You choose it. Elias' breathing steadied slightly, drawn by the sound of the voice. The storm is retreating, Kethvar continued. Rescue probability is increasing. Elias smiled faintly. Knew we'd make it. Outside, the planet fell slowly silent. Inside the broken shelter, held together by outdated metal and human stubbornness, Elias clung to consciousness, having faced the storm head-on and refused to let it take everything. The night was not over, but the worst had passed. Light returned slowly. It did not come all at once. First, a faint glow crept through the cracks in the shelter walls, soft and pale, like morning trying to remember how to exist. Then the floor stopped vibrating. The air pressure evened out. The cold eased just enough to stop biting. The storm was gone, not destroyed, not defeated, simply finished. Elias did not know this yet. He was barely aware of anything. His body lay still on the floor beside the bed, one arm stretched out, fingers curled weakly. His breathing was shallow but steady, each breath a quiet victory. Kethvar watched him without blinking. Minutes passed, or maybe longer. Time still felt strange, stretched thin by everything that had happened. The shelter made a soft clicking sound as emergency systems attempted to restart on their own. One glow strip flickered to life, casting dim light across the room. The walls were cracked, bent, and scarred. The ceiling sagged in places. The bed stood in the center, scratched and damaged but unbroken, and Elias was still alive. Kethvar tested the restraints again. They loosened slightly as the system unlocked from maximum stabilization mode. Slowly, carefully, Kethvar freed themselves and stood for the first time in what felt like an age. The room felt smaller without the storm pressing in. Too quiet. Kethvar knelt beside Elias. They had no medical training for humans, but observation was one thing their kind excelled at. Elias' skin was pale, his face marked with dried blood and dirt. His chest rose and fell unevenly. You endured, Kethvar said softly. Elias did not respond. A distant sound echoed through the ground. Not thunder, engines. Kethvar's head lifted sharply. They activated their wrist display, which flickered weakly but held. Multiple signals appeared: search craft, rescue teams. They are coming, Kethvar said, though Elias could not hear it. Moments later, the ground outside shook again, this time with purpose. Tools struck metal. Voices echoed faintly through layers of wreckage. Heat signature detected. Life signs confirmed. The shelter door groaned as external clamps locked onto it. With a loud hiss and a burst of light, the door was forced open. Fresh air rushed in, warm and clean compared to what remained inside. Human voices followed. We've got two. Careful, structures unstable. Rescue personnel flooded the room, their movements fast but controlled. They froze briefly at the sight of the damage, the bent walls, the single bed at the center like an anchor point. One of them knelt beside Elias immediately. He's alive, the medic said, relief clear in their voice. Barely, but alive. They worked quickly, fitting an oxygen mask over Elias' face, checking his vitals, stabilizing his injuries. Elias groaned faintly as the oxygen filled his lungs more fully for the first time in hours. Kethvar stepped back, allowing them space. Another rescuer approached Kethvar, scanning them cautiously. You hurt? I am functional, Kethvar replied. He requires priority. The rescuer nodded, already on it. As Elias was lifted onto a stretcher, his eyes fluttered open briefly. His gaze was unfocused, but he turned his head slightly as if searching for something. Kethvar leaned closer. You succeeded, they said. We survived. Elias' lips twitched faintly. Told you, he murmured, then slipped back into unconsciousness. They carried him out of the shelter carefully. Outside, the world looked broken but calm. The sky was clearing, clouds thinning into harmless streaks. The ground was scarred but still solid. The storm had passed. Hours later, Elias lay in a medical bay aboard a rescue ship. Machines hummed softly around him, monitoring his condition. Warmth wrapped around his body, easing pain he had barely noticed before. Kethvar stood nearby, arms folded, watching. A human officer approached quietly. "He's stable," she said. "Recovery will take time, but he'll live." Kethvar inclined their head. That outcome was not predicted. The officer smiled tiredly. "Humans do that a lot." Later, after Elias had been transferred to a recovery ward, Kethvar was asked to give an official statement. It was standard procedure. Observers always filed reports. Kethvar stood alone in a quiet chamber, recording device active. "The storm event exceeded all known classifications," Kethvar began. "All survival models failed. The shelter was insufficient by design parameters." They paused briefly. Human engineer Elias Mar compensated for these failures through continuous adaptation, personal sacrifice, and refusal to prioritize efficiency over life. The recording continued. "Human endurance is not rooted in physical superiority. It is rooted in decision-making under pressure. When escape was impossible, the human did not seek advantage. He sought responsibility." Kethvar's voice remained calm, but something in their posture had changed. "I recommend immediate reclassification of humans in frontier operations. They are not auxiliary assets. They are stabilizing forces in environments where systems fail and predictions collapse." The recording ended. Days later, Elias woke fully. The first thing he noticed was warmth. The second was the lack of pain screaming through his body. The third was the quiet. He blinked slowly, eyes adjusting to soft lighting. A ceiling, clean, unbroken. "Well," he muttered hoarsely, "that's new." A familiar shape moved into view. Kethvar stood beside the bed. Elias frowned slightly. "You look less strapped in." "The storm has ended," Kethvar said, "and you are recovering." Elias let out a slow breath. "Good." There was a pause. "You should not have survived," Kethvar added. Elias smiled weakly. "You keep saying that." Kethvar tilted their head. "I will continue saying it. It remains statistically accurate." They stood there for a moment, then spoke again. "The report I submitted will change how your species is viewed." Elias shrugged as much as the medical supports allowed. "Hope it was flattering." "It was honest," Kethvar said. "That is more significant." Silence settled comfortably between them. After a moment, Elias spoke again. "Hey, Kethvar." "Yes." "Next time the galaxy builds an emergency shelter," Elias said, eyes half closed, "maybe they should ask humans how." Kethvar considered this. "I believe they will." Outside the recovery bay, stars drifted past the ship's viewports, calm and distant. The storm was already being studied, measured, debated. But inside the quiet room, none of that mattered. What mattered was simple. When there had been one room, one bed, and no escape from the storm, a human had chosen to stand instead of run, to bend instead of break, and to hold on when letting go would have been easier. And the universe, for once, had been forced to give way.